There's a disease that takes a person's sleep away. Not all at once, a little every night, so slowly that for a mile they don't even notice it's happening. By the time they do, it's already too late to get it back. And somewhere tonight, while you're lying there listening to this, it's happening to someone right now. Don't worry, this one ends gently, I promise. Get comfortable. Let's begin. Hello, I'm Wisplight, and this is Sleep Radio, Episode 4. What if humans never slept again? As always, this one's meant to be listened to with your eyes closed. If you fall asleep before it ends, that's not a problem. That's the whole point. Here's a strange question to fall asleep to. What if you never could again? Not tonight, not ever. What would actually happen to your body, to your mind, to who you are, if sleep simply stopped being available to you? Let's start at the beginning. Hour 1. For the first several hours of staying awake past when you'd normally sleep, almost nothing happens. Your body has reserves. You feel it a little, a dullness behind the eyes, but you function close to normal. That changes faster than most people expect. By around hour 17 or 18, your reaction time and coordination have slipped to roughly what they'd be with a blood alcohol level around the legal driving limit in most places. You haven't had a drink. Your brain is just running on a kind of debt it hasn't been able to pay off. Mood goes next. There's a structure deep in your brain called the amygdala. It's involved in processing threat and emotional intensity. Normally, a region just behind your forehead, the prefrontal cortex, keeps it in check, dampening overreactions before they become overreactions. Sleep deprivation weakens that connection. The amygdala gets louder. The prefrontal cortex gets quieter, which is part of why people who haven't slept feel things more sharply than they should. Small frustrations landing like larger ones. It's not really a personality change. It's a wiring change, temporary and mechanical. And somewhere around this point, something else starts happening, almost without your awareness. Microsleeps. A microsleep is exactly what it sounds like. A few seconds, sometimes less, where your brain simply switches off and back on, often without you noticing it happened at all. Your eyes might stay open. You might keep walking, keep talking, mid-sentence. Which means, somewhere in that gap, for a few seconds, there was no one home. Whatever was steering you was running on something other than a conscious mind. And then it handed control back so smoothly, you never even felt the seam. This is the body trying to take what it needs, in pieces, because you haven't given it the whole thing. It's worth saying, caffeine doesn't really fix any of this. It blocks a molecule called adenosine, which is what makes you feel sleepy in the first place, and that gives you the sensation of alertness back. But underneath that sensation, the actual sleep debt keeps building exactly the same. You're not paying it off. You're just not feeling it for a while. There's older research on rats from sleep labs decades ago that found something stark. Rats kept from sleeping entirely, with no exceptions allowed, didn't just get tired. Within roughly 2 to 3 weeks, they died. Not from any single cause researchers could isolate cleanly, Their bodies simply stopped being able to regulate themselves, temperature control failing, immune systems collapsing, as though sleep wasn't a behavior so much as a basic maintenance process the whole system depended on. Closer to home, drowsy driving studies in humans have found that being awake for around 20 hours produces impairment roughly comparable to driving drunk, which means that somewhere around the end of a long, sleepless day, ordinary people are functionally driving home in a state we'd never let someone get behind a wheel in on purpose. That's hour 24, one full day in, and this is only the beginning of the file. In December of 1964, a 17-year-old named Randy Gardner decided, for a high school science fair project, to see how long he could stay awake. He made it to 264 hours, just over 11 days. By the second day, friends monitoring him noted he was having trouble focusing his eyes. By the third day, he was irritable in a way that wasn't really like him. Small things setting him off, then passing just as quickly. A sleep researcher from Stanford, hearing about the attempt partway through, came to observe him for the rest of it, which is part of why we know as much as we do about what actually happened to him, hour by hour, rather than just the headline number. Around day 3, his coordination had visibly degraded. Reports describe him struggling with simple tasks, naming objects, basic motor coordination, the kind of small failures that, on their own, would seem unremarkable, but stacked together painted a clear picture of a mind running short on something it couldn't substitute for. And underneath all of it, something quieter was also happening. Memory. Sleep, specifically certain stages of it, plays a direct role in consolidating memory, taking what you experienced during the day and filing it somewhere more permanent. Skip enough of it, and that filing process doesn't happen properly. Things that should become memories instead stay loose, half-formed, easily lost. Gardner himself later said that during the experiment, his memory simply began failing him in ways that felt unfamiliar and a little frightening. Not dramatic, just unreliable, like reaching for something that should be there and finding it wasn't. There's an earlier case, too, that the Stanford researcher monitoring Gardner was likely aware of. In 1959, a radio DJ named Peter Tripp stayed awake for 201 hours, broadcasting live from a glass booth in Times Square as a publicity stunt for charity. His decline came faster and harder than Gardner's would, 5 years later. By day 3, he was seeing things that weren't there. A mouse in his shoe, cobwebs on his desk that didn't exist. By day 4, doctors monitoring him noted what looked like a genuine, if temporary, break from reality. Episodes resembling paranoia and psychosis. He accused one of the examining doctors of being an undertaker, there to bury him alive. He recovered too, after a long sleep, though some who knew him said his personality seemed subtly different in the months afterward. That detail has never been fully explained, and it's part of why later researchers were more cautious and more closely supervised when Gardner attempted his own version of the same experiment. 3 days in, and the mind hadn't even started doing the strangest things it was about to do. By day 4, Randy Gardner was experiencing something closer to hallucination. He reported at one point believing he was a famous football player, briefly and without much resistance, as though the boundary between what was real and what wasn't had simply gotten thinner. This isn't unique to him. It's a documented, recurring feature of extreme sleep deprivation in case after case. Here's roughly why. One of the stages of sleep, REM sleep, is when most vivid dreaming happens. Your brain, during REM, is doing something close to a controlled hallucination every night, safely contained inside sleep, where it doesn't interfere with anything. When you're forced to stay awake far past your limit, fragments of that REM activity have been observed bleeding into waking consciousness. Microdreams, essentially, surfacing while you're still upright, still technically awake. The line between dreaming and being awake stops holding the way it normally does. It's a strange kind of evidence, really. Proof that dreaming isn't something that only happens in sleep. It's something sleep usually keeps contained. Take sleep away, and dreaming doesn't disappear. It just stops staying where it's supposed to. By day 5, Gardner's hallucinations had become more vivid. Visual distortions, moments of disorientation about where he even was. And yet, oddly, by the end of the 11 days, several of his cognitive tests had partially stabilized. Not because his brain had adapted, researchers later concluded, but more likely because of the sheer force of will and external structure keeping him upright and responding. It's worth pausing on why this happens at all biologically. Researchers who study extended wakefulness have found that toward the end of these long stretches, parts of the brain appear to begin behaving locally the way they would during sleep, even while the person remains outwardly awake. Small clusters of neurons essentially go offline and rest briefly, out of sync with the rest of the brain, almost like patches of sleep moving through a mind that overall insists it's still awake. Some researchers have called this local sleep, and it may be part of why the mind starts to fragment the way it does. Hallucination, disorientation, brief lapses in coherence. Not because the whole brain has failed, but because different parts of it have quietly started taking the rest none of them were given permission to take. Which means, by this point, you're not really looking at one fully awake mind anymore. You're looking at a kind of patchwork. Some parts of the brain present, others already half asleep, switching in and out without asking. Awake in name, not entirely underneath. Sleep deprivation has also, unfortunately, been used deliberately throughout history as a method of interrogation and coercion, precisely because of how reliably and how quickly it breaks down judgment, memory, and resistance. It's a difficult thing to think about, but it underscores the same point from a different angle. Whatever sleep is doing for the mind, removing it isn't a minor inconvenience. It's closer to dismantling something load-bearing, one support at a time. He recovered, eventually, with sleep. Most of what happened to him reversed, which raises the real question underneath this whole file. What if it didn't reverse? What if the body simply lost the ability to recover the thing it needed? As it turns out, that isn't only a hypothetical. There's an extremely rare genetic condition called fatal familial insomnia. It's caused by a mutation in a single gene, one that leads to a misfolded protein, a prion, accumulating in a part of the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus, among other things, plays a central role in regulating the transition between sleep and wakefulness. A prion is a strange kind of pathogen, different from a virus or bacterium. It's simply a protein that is folded into the wrong shape, and that wrong shape is contagious in a very specific sense. It causes nearby normal proteins to misfold the same way, spreading slowly through brain tissue like a kind of structural rumor, one protein convincing the next to fall into the same broken pattern. The condition was first carefully documented in the 1970s and 80s, traced through an Italian family whose history included a strange, repeated pattern across generations. Relatives who, in midlife, developed unexplained insomnia and who died within a year or two of those first symptoms appearing. For a long time, the family itself kept this mostly private, aware something was wrong, without quite knowing what. It was an Italian physician studying the family across years who eventually connected the pattern to a single inherited mutation. As the condition progresses, that regulation breaks down. People affected by it gradually lose the ability to sleep at all. Not occasional insomnia, but a genuine, progressive loss of the capacity for sleep itself. It typically begins in mid-adulthood. The earliest signs are often subtle: mild insomnia, small changes in mood or alertness, easy to mistake for ordinary stress. Over months, it deepens: panic attacks, phobias that weren't there before. Then, increasingly, the same kind of waking hallucinations Randy Gardner experienced for a handful of days. Except here, there is no 11th day, no recovery point. There's also a related, even rarer condition called sporadic fatal insomnia, which produces nearly identical symptoms without being inherited at all, arising instead from a spontaneous, one-time misfolding event. It tells researchers something important: that this isn't only about a single faulty gene passed through families. It's about how fragile the underlying system really is. That a single misfolded protein, however it arises, can unravel something as fundamental as the ability to sleep. Eventually, those affected enter a state somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, almost permanently, never fully resting, never fully alert. The body continues to need what sleep provides and is simply no longer able to access it. The condition is, currently, always fatal, typically within 8 months to 3 years of the first symptoms. There is no cure, and very few documented cases exist worldwide, since the mutation is exceptionally rare. It's a difficult thing to sit with, but it's also, in a strange way, the most honest answer available to the question this video opened with. We don't have to fully imagine what happens if sleep becomes permanently unavailable to a person. It has happened to a small number of people, and medicine has documented it as carefully and as compassionately as it could. There's one detail from the family's case worth sitting with for a moment. Some of those affected in the earlier stages, before the worst of it set in, described a strange, growing certainty that something nearby was watching them. A presence they couldn't see and couldn't shake, most noticeable late at night, in the dark, in the exact hours when sleep should have been arriving and simply wasn't. Researchers attribute it to the same breakdown we talked about earlier. Threat processing circuitry running without the rest that normally keeps it calibrated. A logical explanation. It doesn't make the detail any less unsettling to imagine, lying awake, certain you're not alone in the room, for months, with no sleep ever arriving to interrupt the feeling. What it tells us, mostly, is this. Sleep isn't a pause button. It isn't optional in the way it sometimes feels late at night, when you're putting it off for one more hour. It's load-bearing, something underneath everything else you are. With that in mind, and a little more gently, let's imagine the larger, stranger version of the question. Not one person, everyone. So, purely as an imaginative exercise now, what if, tomorrow, every human being simply lost the ability to sleep, permanently, all at once? The first days would probably look something like a global, simultaneous version of what Randy Gardner experienced alone in 1964. A world full of people slipping into irritability, then disorientation, then hallucination, all on roughly the same timeline. Within about a week, most of the systems that depend on sustained human attention would likely begin failing. Aviation, power grid monitoring, surgery, driving in any form. Not because people would stop trying, but because the brain doing the trying would no longer be reliably itself. Within a month, if no recovery were possible, you're looking at something closer to the fatal familial insomnia timeline, just experienced by an entire species simultaneously, rather than a handful of individuals, which is a genuinely difficult thing to even hold in your head fully, so we won't dwell here too long. Interestingly, some researchers who study this purely as a thought experiment point out that short, fragmented rest, even brief, involuntary microsleeps, fought against but never fully eliminated, might be the thing keeping such a population alive at all, for a while, in some reduced, fragile way. Not functioning, just persisting. It's not a comforting scenario, however you imagine it, which might be exactly why it's worth knowing how the story actually ends instead, the part that's true every single night. Before we land somewhere gentler, it's worth asking one more honest question. Is there any version of a human being that simply needs less of this? Some genuine exception to everything we've just walked through? There is, as it turns out, a very small one. Researchers have identified rare genetic mutations in a gene called DEC2, among a few others, present in a tiny fraction of people, that allow them to function fully and healthily on noticeably less sleep than everyone else, sometimes as little as 4 to 6 hours a night, without the cognitive decline the rest of us would experience on that schedule. These people are sometimes called natural short sleepers. It's a genuine biological difference, not a habit or a discipline. And importantly, researchers are clear that this isn't something you can train yourself into. It's closer to a rare trait you're simply born with, the same way some people are naturally tall. This matters because it's often misunderstood. There's a long history of polyphasic sleep schedules, the idea that you can split sleep into several short naps across the day and somehow need less of it overall, popularized by various productivity movements over the years. The research on this is fairly consistent. For the overwhelming majority of people, without that rare genetic difference, these schedules don't reduce the actual need for sleep. They just redistribute the debt, and often hide it less successfully than a single solid night would. So while it's tempting to imagine you could simply train your way out of needing what this whole video has been describing, the evidence mostly points the other way. The need itself doesn't move. Only how visibly you're failing to meet it does. With that settled, let's finally talk about why the need exists at all. Here's the gentler, truer ending to all of this. While you sleep, your brain runs something researchers call the glymphatic system, a kind of nightly cleaning process, clearing out metabolic waste that builds up during your waking hours. It's most active during deep sleep, and it's one of the clearest physical reasons your brain needs you to actually stop regularly, not just rest your eyes. At the same time, your memories from the day are being sorted and filed into something more permanent, the same process that broke down in Randy Gardner, and the same process that makes a full night's sleep feel, the next morning, like something has been quietly put back in order. Sleep itself isn't one single state either. It moves in cycles across the night: light sleep, deep sleep, and REM sleep, each one doing something slightly different. Deep sleep is when most of that physical repair and glymphatic cleaning happens. REM sleep, where most dreaming occurs, seems to play its own role in processing emotion, taking the sharper edges off difficult experiences from the day, so that by morning they're remembered without quite as much sting attached to them. Some researchers describe this as a kind of overnight therapy, your brain replaying the day's harder moments in a state where the stress chemistry attached to them is naturally lower, slowly decoupling the memory from the feeling. It's one reason a difficult day can feel almost unbearable at midnight and noticeably more manageable by the next afternoon. Something happened in between, and that something was sleep. So this whole question, what if you never slept again, turns out to have a strange kind of value in it, not as something to fear, as a reminder of what's actually happening every night without you doing anything at all. Your brain repairing itself, sorting itself, quietly taking the edge off whatever the day handed you, getting ready to hand you back to tomorrow in working order. You don't have to do anything to deserve that. You just have to let it happen. And somewhere out there tonight, in some quiet room, someone really is lying awake, unable to do the thing you're about to do, listening to their own house, wishing for exactly this. You're not them, not tonight, so let go of it. And if you're still listening at this point, if it's late and your eyes are heavy and the room around you has gone quiet, that might be exactly the sign worth listening to. Close the file. Let the rest happen on its own.